Hello and welcome to the NERI video podcast series. This week we're going to be discussing climate change and the just transition. Now this is, our conversation is occurring in the context of COP25 in Madrid. And the last several months have seen a rise in the awareness and salience of green politics. We've seen a number of youth strikes, climate strikes. So it seems this is really an issue whose time has come. But of course this issue can't really be undertaken without the participation of many sectors of society, including the trade union movement. So I couldn't really think of any two better guests to have on this week than Sinéad Mercier. She's a researcher involved in just transition and climate change for many different organisations, and Seán McCabe, a researcher on just transition at TASC. And I'd like to welcome you to the show this week. Sinéad, just to open things out, of course, many viewers recognise the importance of climate change and the severity of the situation that we're faced with. But just if you could give some of the kind of international context here, where do we need to go as far as emissions are concerned?
Okay, so thanks very much for having us here again, Paul. And I suppose the situation is quite bleak, let's be honest. We only, according to a most recent report there by the UN FCCC, the IPCC, which is the world's foremost climate experts, and they draft a report saying that we must keep below 1.5 degrees. We've already reached 1 degrees warming. The planet has warmed by 1 degree already. So we only have a 0.5 to go. And if we only have around 10 years or even 8 years now to reach that, to keep below those emissions at a lower level. And if we don't, obviously we're going to lose already small island states. So in the Pacific Ocean, places like the Maldives are already sinking. We already have incredibly high numbers of bushfires all across Australia and America as well. And that's already the situation. The situation is already devastating loss of human life, but also wildlife as well. And that's only going to intensify in the last final 10 years that we have to cope with this situation. And I suppose how just transition comes into this is that we're dealing with it in a time that when our belief in states and kind of formal institutions is receding. So human, I suppose in the Western world in particular, after the recession, and generally as well, a kind of a feeling of a loss of faith in established institutions. And they would be politics, they would be the state, they would also be trade unions to a certain extent as well, and also kind of corporate interest too. And so you're dealing with this kind of crisis of faith, which is resulting in things like Brexit or like vote for Trump, and increasing inequality as well. So for the past 10 years, the amount of real wage growth has decreased for the longest period of time since probably the Napoleonic Wars. So, and also the proportion of wealth that is that kind of wages is also inequality is increasing in that you have more and more people who are over €100,000 a year. They're increasing in their wage growth, while other people are decreasing, especially the middle classes. But you also have capital in general is decreasing in its proportion in that it's going to wages. We've more and more money being squirreled away into tax havens, more and more money being taken from tax pockets of governments who could deal with this situation, more money being taken from workers, again, who work in these workplaces, and trade union power. And an awful lot of it is being sequestered away, completely hidden. There's about 8.7 trillion missing in tax havens, which could solve climate change twice over and the biodiversity crisis that we're facing. And I suppose for me, that's where the just transition question comes in. This is a particular moment in time that will result in, the devastation of the human race and the planet that we live on. And it's for the greed and wealth of a very small few who probably wouldn't know what to do with it anyway on a dead planet. So that's where I am.
Yeah, it takes us back to that old adage, no jobs on a dead planet. And that kind of nicely frames the just transition aspect of our discussion today. Of course, there's the issue of mitigations, carbon mitigation that has to occur, but then there's the kind of conjoined issue of, in the context of increasing inequality, we should, at least part of the just part of that framing is that this is a matter of values. We should address that, and any transition shouldn't really exacerbate that situation. So, Seán, I know you've done a bit of work in the context of Ireland. How are the governments, or Ireland in general, how are our current commitments related to that overall picture? Are they sufficient, really? And if not, why not?
Well, I think maybe to take a step back before talking about Ireland, and just on your point on the moral commitment to a just transition, it's also a very practical commitment in terms of addressing inequality at the same time as addressing climate change, because simply the transformation is so great, as Sinéad has framed, that we won't do it unless people buy into it. And if people see themselves getting worse off or becoming more marginalised as a result of climate action, they'll refuse it. And so we won't be successful. So there's an enlightened self-interest to all of this, where you actually, if you want to see radical transformation on the scale necessary to keep emissions below the 1.5 degrees that really preserves life as we know it on this planet, then you have to address the underlying inequality issues. To talk to Ireland, it's been well framed. The Taoiseach once said, called us laggards, and I think everyone within trade unions and civil society and everywhere else have used that term to describe how we have behaved in terms of our climate contributions. We're not anywhere near where we need to be in terms of emissions reductions. That's why there are fines coming down the line for missing our commitments under the Kyoto Protocol. And despite now having a climate action plan, and having declared a climate and biodiversity emergency, we're still, there's no evidence yet that a shift is coming. One issue I would take with everything, and back to the first point, is that we have yet to really fully appreciate that intersection between inequality, poverty and marginalisation and climate action in Ireland. It's not unusual. Many countries in the world haven't managed to put that together, but it will be critical. And a perfect example of this would be the agricultural sector, which, despite having very significant carbon footprint, and despite farmers being on the front lines of climate change, in that once our climate starts to become more chaotic in Ireland, it will be farmers who will struggle first. Despite that, and despite the fact that farming or the agricultural sector in general is the most unequal in terms of income, there is no plan in place in the climate action plan to support farmers in any sort of transition as a result of climate change. And so I think there you're seeing the nexus both of climate impacts, climate mitigation measures, and the role that inequality will play. And unless we start taking that very seriously very quickly, we risk leaving farmers stranded. We talk about stranded workers in terms of Bord na Móna or other fossil fuel extractive processes around the world, but other communities risk being left stranded as a result of climate action.
Yeah, Seán, in your research, you note the idea that kind of current policy, particularly in the agricultural area, it might lock farmers in.
Well, we I suppose we've come across in many realms of the climate negotiations the concept of lock-in. If we were to go out and build a coal-fired power plant now, that's an infrastructural investment that maybe takes 30, 40, 50 years to see out its life, and you're essentially locking yourself into coal dependency. It's very similar if you start for a family. Like, you have to remember, Ireland is predominantly based on family farming, and families have to manage the books of their own household just like anyone else. And if you make a decision to pursue a carbon intensive form of agriculture, say for example dairy, and you borrow to expand your ability to have a larger herd, then you're really committing to that larger herd, and the family unit bears the debt and has to repay that debt, and you would hope for the security of those firms that they're able to make that repayment, but there is a risk that as we delay longer in taking climate action, that climate action will become rushed and it won't consider people who may be very badly affected by changes in how we have to orient our sectors, and agriculture is one such sector.
Yeah, that seems a common theme in many areas. I mean, there's a lot of talk, and it's a good idea, of course. Everyone recognises the idea of retrofitting your house. That's a policy that should be pursued. You save on energy, improve quality of life in that respect, even maybe some health outcomes. So it seems one that's kind of indisputable in its logic. Yet at the same time, government programs tend to approach this as an after the fact kind of they'll grant you some of what you have to kind of you have to support the initial. You have to incur the initial kind of capital cost. And as my colleague Kieran has noted, there's a huge number of people in Ireland who can't support expenses of €1,000 according to Silk data. So it doesn't seem plausible, really, that we can approach this from a situation of individual choices to augment your home, in the absence of a strong public policy to make that easier. Although I suppose we've been talking about some issues and some difficulties. I hope our audience isn't too alarmed by what we're saying. Although still, it's good to know the kind of scale of the challenge we face. So that would raise the question, Sinead, if you know of any examples elsewhere that might offer templates that we might copy.
In terms of the energy efficiency or just transition?
In terms of just transition, I mean, energy efficiency might be one such example, but how should we approach this?
Well, there's no, I suppose this is the very, very interesting, but again, kind of unsteady element of just transition and climate action in general. I mean, our whole way of life as human beings since very, I suppose, going back to prehistoric era or Christianity or so on, people debate when it began. But our whole way of life is predicated on the exploitation of what's around us. I mean, the environment environs us. Mm-hmm. So we take for human society, and increasingly in neoliberal eras for the human individual or for the market. So that kind of taking extractivism sort of approach is very much deep in our psyche, and it needs to be changed. We need to move beyond growth, extractivism, production, to maybe a society that is more in keeping with the environment around us and also our society too. And I don't really know of any society that perhaps has done that, which is exciting in one way. I mean, we put a man on the moon. We have spaceships out in space. This is kind of what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez calls like our moonshot moment. So there is something very exciting in that, the creation of a new society, a new way of being that is better and kinder. And it couldn't come at a more needed time. We can see around us, like I used to do soup runs in Dublin, and since 2014 or earlier, the scale of homelessness that we're dealing with, people sleeping in every doorway in Henry Street, I mean, that's shocking and is unsustainable. And I'm from Carrow as well, in County Galway and Carrua, and the depletion of biodiversity in that region as well already occurring. So we're tackling a range of issues at once, which is brilliant. But how do we get there and how do we do that is kind of open for debate. So far, market approaches have been taken, and I can kind of understand where it came from around the creation of the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the Kyoto Protocol and so on. Many market mechanisms approaches were taken, so emissions trading schemes, carbon pricing, the idea that you let the state step back because they'll only muddy the waters, and you let the market kind of operate. And Cass Sunstein actually has a good article on the origins of the Kyoto Protocol and how it came from how Californian firms dealt with the removal of CFCs from their products, and they kind of had a market approach. It worked quite well in that situation, but then they tried to apply it to the international problem of CO2, which is in everything. I mean, oil and gas are in everything. It's much more difficult. So that kind of market mechanisms approach has been thoroughly undermined. I mean, there's a wealth of research now from all aspects of society that have shown that the emissions trading scheme in the EU completely broken. And also as well, the way that it was approached, for example, in Australia or other countries that looked to the EU, was that they didn't engage with the kind of communities that it was going to worst affect. So in Australia, for example, under the Gillard government in 2011, they decided to copy a lot of what was happening in the EU. And, fair enough, they thought EU, fantastic, bastions of global climate action, and they were at the time. So let's do what they did. But the coal communities that were reliant on these coal power stations, they were generally quite similar, for example, to Bord na Móna or a lot of coal companies in the UK. They were very rural areas that were based around one coal plant, coal mine, and it was all very kind of, everybody worked there, everybody had a great lifestyle. And now suddenly this emissions trading scheme was coming in after years of privatisation, which also kind of reduced the workforce massively, reduced pay and conditions. And now a second transition was coming in under the auspices of climate action. And it was kind of presented as a public good, which happened with Thatcher as well, kind of, we're closing these coal mines for climate reasons. This is, it's also to better the English state, but it's also for climate reasons. And I suppose when you do something like that without engaging with people or explaining to them, or even allowing someone that knows far more than you about coal or coal plants to be even engaged in the conversation about carbon, I mean, it's madness, really. It's very, very, not even elitist, but arrogant that you would know better than people working in this all their lives. So I suppose the main principle is transparency and public engagement. So allowing people around the table with you, so worker co-determination, which worked quite well in Germany with the closure of the coal mines there, the hard coal mines there, and in Germany, in Australia, in Canada, in Spain, the bringing of everybody around the table in social dialogue and discussing the future. So you make it less frightening and terrifying. You have to move people to something that they can see in front of them, because our past transitions that have happened, whether it was globalization or whether it was shifting from one type of government to another, they generally have been done very, very badly. And people are going to look to a new transition and see how it's been implemented in one place, and if it goes badly, if it goes terribly wrong, they'll resist it in any way that they can, even if all they have is peanuts. So I suppose that's the lesson, engaging and bringing people with you and making sure that there is a good future and that people will be looked after.
Yeah, I suppose in our own research at NERI, looking at one dimension of potential just transition, particularly skills, a recent paper of ours. But a lot of the international literature suggests that, I mean, the concept of just transition is a trade union concept originally from the 1970s, I believe, from the United States, from, I think, a leader of a coal trade union.
Yeah, Tony, oh, I shouldn't, I had to edit it. Tony Mazzucato. I can't remember his name.
It's something like
Mazzucchi.
Yeah,
maybe, Mazzucchi.
Listeners, message in, But yeah, the kind of idea that these things are necessarily counterposed is one that we kind of have to break apart. That this necessarily means suffering for communities, and I'm just reminded of the old, I think it might be a union adage, nothing about us without us. But should you engage the workers and trade unions in this, that's essential for practical implementation and as you've said, Seán, for its political feasibility. If these communities are involved, they'll both both you'll have regional and local issues brought to the table that might not otherwise have been. So there's an implementation, a practical implementation issue here, element. But for buy-in, as you say, for something on the scale that's required, as you've said, Sinead, in terms of the overall context, this is a moonshot effort. This is unprecedented. Now, we have glimmers, as you've mentioned, the example of the Ruhr. There are examples where we have something of a template for kind of how to get somewhere regionally. And that's particularly important in the context of the Midlands and Bord na Móna and what we do about the future there. We might kind of continue sort of discussing our communities, or the perception, at least that the agricultural community are a major impediment to any just transition here. Would that be your kind of feeling on things, Seán?
I wouldn't actually say that at all. No, I think that it's understandable. Perhaps there's a significant misconception, I would say, about where farmers themselves stand on the issue of climate change. Mm-hmm. I think I was fortunate enough to take a van around the country in August and September and meet with an awful lot of farmers who understand what's happening, who see the challenge ahead, but who are also will readily tell you that they've spent years being told to make their land more productive and to undertake actions which ultimately were bad for the environment, but it wasn't they who set out to damage the environment. It was guidance that was given in order to enhance food security. And I think, rightly, as you say, it's the just transition has emerged from trade unions, and it is a trade union concept, but it's an incredibly useful framework as well to move into sectors where trade unions aren't very prevalent, and agriculture is an example of that. And actually, the lens of food security is a really useful lens to understand the just transition by, because we will all need to eat all the way through whatever is going to unfold in the future. Our current model is an extractive model where you have time and money and effort being extracted both from the consumer and the producer by the likes of your Lidls and Aldis and Tesco's, who basically offer incredibly cheap price on food, which allows people who are time poor and just financially poor to subsist. And then on the other side of that, they put enormous pressure on the producer to produce food at the lowest possible price. All of that extraction then leaves the community where the producer and the consumer operate. So if you follow that lens back, like that frame of logic back further, you have a need to enable the producer to be paid a fair price for their product. And that requires the consumer making a living wage, perhaps. It requires the consumer having a 4-day work week, perhaps, to enable them the time. They definitely need a kitchen, so they need a house. So there's a right to housing issue here. So very quickly, through the lens of food security, looking at the challenge and the transformation that we face, you can actually extrapolate out the basis of a system whereby people do more than subsist. They can live with dignity and they can live full and healthy lives. And if we are to talk about just transition that expands beyond this concept of substituting green jobs for brown jobs, which actually is incredibly difficult to do and incredibly limited in its scope, we have to start looking more holistically at the community that surrounds the brown, I suppose, development pathway that we've been on, the dirty development pathway that we've been on, and think about, well, how do we meaningfully rewire this so that communities can keep wealth locally, so that workers can easily move, whether they're farmers or whether they're in Bord na Móna or wherever they are in the country. If they need to, they can move to other jobs that pay them just as well or better, and enhance their way of life. And then also we have to look at how our community acts with its local economic model, and how that economic model supports the community rather than the community supporting the economic model, which is the current system that we have.
Yeah, I mean, in again, kind of framing this in the context of the Midlands, if you look at some of the data, you have some of the poorest labour force participation rates in the country. It's one of the poorest regions of the country, lowest rates of internal FDI. So there's no, in the absence of that kind of holistic thinking, imagining that simply, many of the reports that we see kind of talk about the potential of green jobs, and that's useful to consider, and there's a lot of work to be done to that extent, and there's X million jobs on offer here. But in the absence of kind of some plan to actually address these impacts, the kind of prospect of spontaneously the Midlands taking off in a green technological revolution, given the current backdrop, it doesn't seem very plausible. At least in the absence of some work from government to actually kind of steer the ship. And that's actually going to be the subject of some work from ourselves. The idea of maybe potentially pursuing something like an entrepreneurial state model, the Mazzucato model, where the state tries to kickstart R&D and technological development in an area, and particularly to try and kind of entrench it in a concept we call clustering. So that's all very interesting. The kind of community wealth model. Is there any template that kind of is based on?
Yeah, well, there's examples. The challenge is that the examples that currently exist are all urban, which is good, and actually we could do it looking at them here in Ireland. You know, the Preston model, for example, in the United Kingdom. The Preston model provides a very useful example of Preston in Lancashire in the UK, where there has been, since 2013, or well, since earlier, on the back of the global financial crisis, an effort by the local council to change procurement practices for municipal buildings so that the money is spent either within Preston or within Lancashire. And despite the council budget dropping by a significant amount during the years of austerity, the amount of local expenditure has gone up. And I think it's really easy to visualise that. You know, you have universities all across Dublin where there is food being prepared and sold, and I don't know the figures, but there's an exceptional amount of food sold to students every year. If that was procured from farms within the hinterland of Dublin, it would be an incredible economic boon for those communities. It's kind of a no-brainer. What we need to do is also figure out a system whereby, I think this is where the just transition could actually become an incredibly powerful accelerator of growth, but and positive growth, not but whereby we don't have the same anchor institutions that you have in cities, in rural parts. You don't have very many libraries or universities or those major institutions that would be making a big spend on stuff like lunch. But actually, and you touched upon it earlier, we've this pressing need to take climate action. And I think the ideology upon which that climate action is rolled out is incredibly important. If we persist with the market-based approaches that Sinéad is talking about, we miss a massive opportunity for development. Because if how we roll out renewables, if how we roll out retrofitting, the electrification grid, if that's done through cooperative models which pay living wages and create local jobs, there's an enormous opportunity to take what's, I don't like the phrase, but we talk about rural decline, we talk about the loss of young people from rural areas, we talk about the loss of essential services like post offices and Garda stations, we talk about the amalgamation of GA clubs and the closing of pubs. If we could turn that on its head, if climate action is planned in the right way, it can provide a temporary anchor institution for community wealth building, which can then start a ball rolling that will, as you're talking about, lead to community-led expertise. It trusts in the community to have the knowledge to then plan a future once you get on that first rung that allows you to perhaps become a hub of research, to become producer of very high quality local produce of some description, whatever that is. But the catalyst can be climate action.
Yeah.
And we're missing that opportunity currently.
Even that is something that's been taken actually in Australia, it's the Latrobe Valley Authority, and also in Scotland there's increasing push for procurement contracts. They have an awful lot of offshore wind farms, but the wind farm turbines, despite manufacturing hubs being in Fife or other areas around Scotland, the turbines are being, the jackets are being shipped in from Indonesia, which also has a massive climate cost as well, shipping them the whole way. But the procurement model that they've taken in Latrobe Valley in Australia, in Victoria, Australia, is really, really good. They've got about maybe at least 30 firms, if not more, coming together to commit to procuring only from local suppliers. And it's already adding not only, as you said, kind of like local jobs and so on, but kind of a local resilience and a local kind of self-belief that we can do this. We don't need to be reliant on outward foreign direct investment always. I mean, I know there's arguments for kind of obviously opening up societies and so on from foreign investment, but generally what's happened in kind of Australia, in Australia as well, after privatisation of the energy system, and in Wales and in other formerly coal-reliant communities, was they relied on outside investment in order to boost the economy again, which resulted in call centres and warehouses, which, not all of them are bad, but generally very low wages, very kind of mobile companies that will just up and go whenever. While what they're doing in Australia is absolutely fascinating. The whole approach of the Latrobe Valley Authority is about doing things differently and building that kind of local resilience, local strength. And procurement is a big thing. I mean, what happened with cervical check, for example, was that it was only quality indicators that were taken, cost efficiency indicators that were taken into account, rather than perhaps there was companies in UCC, I think it was, or another university in Ireland that would have been able to take the contract had they been given a bit more time. And then, arguments could be made there for better quality control. But why not have that kind of local procurement approach taken by councils and so on? And that's a beginning. I know we're aiming for, the moonshot, the new fantastic society, but there are steps there, and building that local resilience and capacity to imagine change in communities that have always been reliant on one thing, whether it's farming or whether it's one company in the area. That is a very difficult mental shift for somebody, for a community. Even one example in the Ruhr, Bismarck never wanted a university in the Ruhr, in that area, because he believed the educated, if the sons and daughters of miners were educated, it would cause large scale revolution. So, which is fascinating. He actually, he actually said it in speeches. So they never had a university until 1972, around there, and that kind of kick-started. Then the government helped to set that up. And it kick-started a kind of technological, this kind of techno-utopia kind of language is used often with climate action. But I'm a big reader of Ursula K. Le Guin and her approach to educating people and allowing people to conceptualise their place in the world. And I think there's no university in the Midlands. If you look at kind of where university centres are, there's a big gap in the centre of the country. So I think that could be one thing. And the transition teams that they've set up now in the Midlands is looking at kind of Athlone IT and other ITs. But I do think an education approach might be a really, really good focus. In the Ruhr, it was fascinating. They looked at where their weaknesses were. So their weaknesses were like mass environmental damage from the coal mining and coal plants and a lot of pollution. But in fact, that was a strength because they knew then how to mitigate it, or how other countries could mitigate the same problems. I mean, there's a fundamental problem. It's still fossil fuels and still pollution. But it started a big environmental technology and environmental law industry, which required very highly qualified, highly paid workers. They knew the unions and the local community and the businesses in the area and the government. They all knew that it was a highly unionised workplace, and that foreign direct investment just from America or wherever was just no-go, because they were highly organised, highly a community used to very high wages, so they had to create their own alternative employment, because it wasn't going to come, a warehousing or a call centre wasn't going to base itself somewhere where people, are very highly educated and highly skilled, well, not highly educated, but highly skilled, highly educated from apprenticeship point of view, of course. But so that kind of, they needed to create their own kind of industries, which I think is that kind of learned helplessness approach that we've kind of gotten into with neoliberalism, I think needs a revamp. Like fundamentally, I believe people are highly, this kind of era of anger at elites, or kind of everyone watches The West Wing and think they can apply The West Wing to real life. And the idea that technocrats will solve everything, I think, I don't know, I don't think that fits the Irish psyche quite well. I think we're kind of, like education is quite highly prized. We are quite highly educated and value each other and our different opinions, and no matter your background, you're still highly articulate and still able to engage very well in society. And I think that idea that people are just a waste or a kind of a lower level that shouldn't be engaged with does not apply here, and that is a strength. And I would like to see that taken into account with just transition, that it's not about elites making decisions for others, it's not about forcing a transition down people's throats, it's about us all working together to create a transition, and everyone is just as valuable, no matter expertise or not. I mean, the environmental movement itself has whole problems, like Latour, the idea of what a scientist is entirely objective and entirely correct, that environmentalists, just because they have a certain few degrees, are entirely correct. It needs a discussion.
I think on that exact point, where we risk going very wrong is by saying we do climate action now, and that's what we're going to do, is we're going to start doing. We need to go into communities, understand community priorities, understand community needs, and then understand how climate action solves those needs. And if we look at it through that lens, where you're saying actually we've taken a participative approach, we've let communities to identify their own priorities, and then we've used climate action to solve those priorities, social approval for climate action won't be a problem. People will see that it enhances their lives, people will see that it results in them being better off individually and as a community. And if we can drive that notion of community, that sort of like antidote to neoliberalism through this, then like the potential for really positive transformation in the country is huge. And I think that link between, if someone in Ireland gets a little bit too big for their boots, we get a bit sick of them, and that's a really healthy thing, because we know that we all have inherent dignity, we know that we all have inherent knowledge, and that local knowledge will be key, like channeling that local knowledge and embracing it, and knowing where expertise should draw the line and should start listening to local knowledge will be incredibly important.
Yeah, I suppose that's the flip side to this. There's the whole issue that obviously this presents an enormous challenge, but it also, life could be better in many of these regions, as things currently stand. I mean, some of our work that I worked on with my colleague Paul McFlynn last year, you see Ireland it's very divided developmentally, in terms of, at least in productivity, but that has implications for wages and what have you. But you have the FDI sector, and then there's all the rest. And obviously FDI is kind of concentrated in around the cities, and the rest of the country doesn't. We have a lot of employment in low-wage industries related to tourism, say, or accommodation and food. And that isn't really going to set people up for, a good quality of life. So this kind of green transition could actually be a developmental model for Ireland, rather than simply, an austere one that says you can't do anything fun anymore, Just to kind of close out our discussion on a positive note, I might turn the kind of question to how you see that positive transition kind of arising. What kind of potential is there? What could be?
Do you want to start?
Yes, well, it's difficult, but I mean, the definition of low carbon work that's often talked about is like renewable energy, or kind of increasingly energy efficiency as well. And just transition approaches have always kind of looked mainly at transitioning coal or other fossil fuel heavy sectors. But I mean, low carbon work is also artists, it's also healthcare, it's also teachers, it's educators, it's a kind like the very high, there's also kind of, we also need to make our products more like closer to home and so on, out of very good quality materials. But I mean, this is kind of a bit of a bugbear for me, but I do believe that there is kind of a role for the artist more in these discussions. The other way of seeing, the local metis and knowing, the understanding that nature is this great, often calculable, but often not, and just strange. And sometimes we need to be comfortable with that strangeness and find a way of dealing with it in a way that's made through negotiation, through speaking to one another, through deciding through our state. And I still believe that there is a role for the state. I don't think that these kind of, I think community assemblies and so on are good, but the state could be a good thing. It could be truly democratic, and our workplaces should be more democratic too. We spend most of our lives at work nowadays. And why not have more workplace democracy, more say over what happens, more other ways of seeing of how the workplace or work itself should be defined. And I'm not talking about universal basic income only, but also universal basic services and more autonomy at work. And I think that the Google and Facebook and other kind of like big data companies are working increasingly with the fossil fuel sector in order to automate a lot of their enterprises. The offshore oil and gas industry is increasingly automating, and massive job losses are coming from that, not really from oil and gas, like moving away from oil and gas in terms of climate agreements. And that's quite dangerous because you're removing not only trade unions but people. And like often our workplaces become more democratic, our businesses become better when the people inside them have more say over where they're going. And you can see that with Dunnes Stores strike and many other examples of it. And if we remove people and replace them with automatable robots, like I'm not saying robots are all bad, personally, luxury communism, but I mean... But I do think that there is, I think that need that kind of, workplace democracy. I do think a bit more of it would be very, very positive. And so...
I think if we accept the premise that inequality will cause climate action to fail, then if we can imagine a world where we survive, it has to be a more equal world, and it has to be radically more equal, not just within our own society here in Ireland, but globally. Like, you know, we haven't spent much time today talking about the global dimension, but there's 1 billion people living in energy poverty. That has to be solved, and it has to be solved using renewables. We have to reach a point whereby local governments are empowered and people see a real value in their vote, both at the local election polls and at the national, and where there is a genuine sense of ownership of our democracy, and where this system of like parsing out our communities and individualizing people and making people struggle has been pushed back on completely, and we rediscover the agency that exists within our communities, because it's incredible. Like, if you put the net out into any community, the amount of experts you'll get, the amount of artists, the amount of engineers, the amount of nurses, and like you find an incredible bedrock upon which we can build anything. But those communities are not currently connected. We all feel very individualized and very much on our own. So actually, an awful lot of maybe what people are searching for through self-help or through running fanatically or seeking out like those antidotes to the situation we find ourselves in neoliberalism will actually be solved by taking a climate action that builds on community and gives people a sense of place and a sense of belonging. And from there, we build out a more equal world. That'd be my sense.
Well, on that positive note, you might have been given some material to be quite alarmed, but also there's a silver lining here, and there's the possibility of a much better life across Ireland, across the world. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our guests. That was a very interesting discussion. And please tune in again, watch our Twitter feed, Facebook for more material. We will soon be putting up our recent lecture on the subject of a Green New Deal for Ireland by Dr. Lorna Gold. That was our Donald Nevin lecture this year, and the just transition isn't going away as a subject of work at NERI. So I'm sure this will be just the first of many such discussions.
Thank you.
Thank you.